That's a beautiful gospel reading from the Gospel of John, but I'm not going to preach on it. I decided to preach on our first lesson from 1 Samuel because a lot of elements in that story really appealed to me. Now, we heard that the boy Samuel had never before heard the voice of the Lord, so he couldn't possibly recognize it. It even took his mentor Eli 3 times before he realized that God was calling to Samuel. If it took time for Samuel to recognize the voice of the Lord, how much harder it is for us. It's hard enough for us to really listen to one another. There's a great story about President Franklin Roosevelt, who grew frustrated with long receiving lines at the White House and people paying no attention to what he or anyone else was saying. So he decided to have a little fun with things. So during one reception, he tried this experiment. As each person came along the line to shake his hand, he murmured, "I murdered my grandmother this morning." What was their response? "Marvelous, keep up the good work." Obviously, they weren't paying attention. The exception was the ambassador from Bolivia, who actually listened to what FDR said, but was extremely perplexed and troubled by it. So he stammered in response, "Well, I'm sure she had it coming." How much harder it is for us to listen for God. For one thing, we are distracted by all our activities and responsibilities. For example, you parents with 1 or more young children dealing with ferrying them to school and doctors and soccer games, getting them fed and put to bed at a reasonable hour. I'm not sure you have or feel you have very much contemplative time. Maybe for a few minutes as you drop into bed exhausted. Sometimes it can feel almost impossible to find time either for ourselves or for God. I'm reminded of another harried parent. He was named Charles Swindoll. He wound up writing a book called Stress Fractures. And he was indeed stressed to the breaking point and beginning to take it out on his family. As he writes, "I was snapping at my wife and our children, gobbling down my dinners and incredibly frustrated at anything interrupting my work. Things around our house started to reflect my hurry-up style, and it was becoming unbearable for all of us. One night," he writes, "my daughter Colleen wanted to tell me something important that had happened with her at school that day. She began hurriedly, 'Daddy, I want to tell you something, and I'll tell you really fast.' Suddenly, he realized that he was the one causing all this frustration, and it humbled him. And he said, he told her, 'Honey, you can tell me, and you don't have to tell me really fast. Tell me slowly.' And then Colleen said to him, 'Then listen slowly.'" What does it mean for us to listen slowly? Listening to what other people are trying to tell us is a good beginning. Sometimes God's most important messages come through the familiar voice of a family member or a friend, just like it did for Charles, hearing his daughter's voice. The next step is to break out of our patterns of busyness, if only for a little while. To take a walk in the woods, sometimes by the sea, or even just around our own neighborhood. Taking in surrounding sights and sounds that we often tend to tune out. But you don't even have to leave home to clear the way for God. We can set aside a specific time and place for us to collect our thoughts, perhaps to pray, maybe at the kitchen table over a cup of coffee, maybe at our desk after we have turned off the computer or the tablet or the phone, just for a little while. Our prayers don't have to be particularly formal. We don't even have to use words. It's important to allow silence to punctuate our praying. Now, I have to confess to one particular use of technology coming through an app on my phone, and this is a very special one because it links me to a site called Pray As You Go. It's short. It begins with some chanting or beautiful instrumental music. And after that, the reader presents one biblical passage, read twice, slowly. And they include a few meditative, provocative questions for us to ponder. As its name suggests, you can take Pray As You Go anywhere. It provides a gentle, lovely way to learn how to listen slowly. Here's another question. How do we know if what we're hearing is really God's voice? One clue is that the same message keeps coming back. God's voice is as persistent for us as it was for Samuel. It took Samuel 3 times until he learned to say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." It may take even longer for us, but that's all right. As today's reading from the Hebrew Scriptures suggests, God is incredibly patient. God will keep whispering in our hearts until we are ready to listen, slowly. Especially when we're hearing what we don't want to hear, when we hear a call to make a change we don't want to make. That also was true for Samuel. He was reluctant to give his mentor Eli the very bad news God had disclosed to him. God told Samuel that he would hold Eli responsible for not correcting his wayward sons, and his household will fall into disgrace. Even so, just beyond the passage that we heard today, Eli insists on hearing that bad news. Eli says to Samuel, "What was that he told you? Do not hide it from me. May God do so to you and more also, if you hide anything from me of all he told you." So Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. Then Eli said, "It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him." From this difficult, challenging first experience, Samuel grew to become a trustworthy prophet. He would challenge King Saul and go on to anoint David as king in his place. As the Bible teaches, listening for God is not for the faint-hearted. We have to test what we hear in real-life experience. We have to dare to ask difficult questions of ourselves. And we have to be willing to share those questions with people who can interpret them faithfully. But in our questioning, God's voice will always be there, sometimes as a whisper, sometimes as a shout. But if Samuel is any model, the best we could do is to say, with some trepidation, but always with trust, Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.